Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our worst map ever series by looking at the map Fulda. And before we get started with the map itself, it's probably time for some interesting tidbits of history. When Fulda was first released, and actually for quite a while afterwards, it actually had live tank models of American M60s. They didn't actually move or anything, but they were basically identical to the Tectri M60. So if you were in an American M60 with no decals and the default camo, you could just park next to these tanks and blend in. Ultimately, alongside a lot of the destroyed Panther models and stuff like that, the developers decided that because of a lot of the gameplay inconsistencies that went with having essentially live vehicle models on the map, that they wanted to go through and remove them. So it's not currently on the map, but it is an interesting piece of trivia. And if you go back to the original Fulda release blog for the game, you can still see where the tank models were previously located. And as one last piece of vaguely useless, or maybe even a little useful trivia, Fulda is actually the map that I have earned and dropped the most nukes on. So maybe I will have some insights, or maybe not. You'll just have to wait and see. Now, Fulda currently has a total of 7 different variants. 2 of them are Big Fulda and 5 of them are Small Fulda. The only real difference between Big Fulda and Small Fulda is that the Big Fulda map just increases the play area by a relatively small amount. The map is pretty large, but on the whole it doesn't really change how you play because a lot of the major points of interest for the map are very similar. It just adds some play area to the far left and right side of the map. So on the whole, a lot of the advice that I'm going to give you would apply equally to both versions of the map. Interestingly, Big Fulda only has 2 variants, a 2 cap and a 3 cap, whereas Small Fulda has a 2 cap, a 3 cap, and the individual A, B, and C caps. Now obviously we're going to start where we usually start all of these, and that is by looking at the 2 caps to see if it is actually worth going for these zones. In general, I would say both Big Fulda and Small Fulda 2 caps have very similar setups. The zones are only a fairly small distance away from each other actually, so in general you need about the same amount of work to capture them. The southern zone isn't that bad because you are on a nice little hill and you can look down on the spawns, so generally speaking the enemy does have to do some work to get to you, but it is still a fairly exposed position and you will still have to stay there for a fairly long time, and there is no real cover on the point. The north cap, however, is actually really exposed and generally is very easy to see and access from the enemy spawn points. So if you are in the north spawn, going for the southern capture point is viable, albeit it's not really a great idea in most cases. However, if you are in the southern spawn, taking the northern cap is actually going to be a bit of a chore, and you might as well not even bother unless the enemy is just out of vehicles. Now, as far as the individual capture points, I'm actually going to start by looking at the B cap because the B cap is identical on both variants of the map, whereas the A and C cap actually extend out a bit depending on which version you're playing. The B cap itself is on a relatively elevated position, basically in the middle of the map. What this essentially means is that it's not that difficult to approach the B cap without being seen, although there are some positions from A cap that might be able to see you if you deviate a little bit too far to the left hand side of the map, so it is important to be aware of. Once you get on the B cap does have some cover in the form of various buildings. However, one thing I would note is that the buildings on the B cap are destructible, so if a lot of artillery is called in or some airstrikes come in, you will lose that cover. However, one of the buildings on B cap, specifically the one to the furthest left, actually can be partially destroyed to where you can actually drive in it, which is a pretty cool trick if you have a vehicle that is small enough to do so. Now, in regards to the 2 A cap positions, the first A cap is in a small little village to the immediate left and north of B cap, and the other A cap position on Large Fulda is even north still in a small camp. Both of these actually provide pretty good cover. However, the approach to the Large Fulda A cap is incredibly exposed to a lot of elevated positions, while the approach to the Small Fulda A cap is actually pretty easy to get to without being actively contested for both sides. It is important to remember that no matter which side you are on, the left-hand side of the A cap, this big open field, is actually pretty important to control. The C cap, however, is where we start seeing some of the largest variations between Big Fulda and Small Fulda. In Small Fulda, the C cap is squarely centered on this castle here, and it is actually a pretty defensible position if you can get to it, and the approaches to it are not difficult. It actually leads to a lot of fights in and around the castle when you do get Small Fulda. On Big Fulda, however, it moves all the way out to this little outpost in the middle of a large open field that is overlooked by a lot of different vantage points that can easily snipe you from a mile away. So the C cap in Large Fulda is actually incredibly difficult to get to without getting killed. More importantly, is incredibly difficult to get off of and make any room, because basically everywhere that you can go that is useful is uphill and across an uncomfortable amount of open ground. It's not uncommon on the large Fulda map to see the C point uncaptured several minutes into the map just because of how difficult it is to access. Now, in terms of movement lanes, the biggest thing that you're going to want to note when moving on Big Fulda is specifically that A and C are actually very low in terms of elevation to the rest of the map. This means you're going to have a lot of sniper points both around the spawn and ringing those areas that will be able to shoot down on you. This creates a rather interesting situation with Big Fulda, where generally speaking you either want to take it as close to the high ground as possible near the B point to try and get up to those capture points, or alternatively you want to swing around as wide as possible to put as much distance as you can between you and your opponents to reduce the likelihood that they will see you. This means that Big Fulda effectively has 5 pseudo movement lanes, one going more or less directly to B, then you have 2 more movement lanes going near B but around the A and C points, and then you have 2 more movement lanes that go all the way out to the outside. That being said, Fulda doesn't have what I would really define as hard movement lanes on either the big or small version, so there's a lot of freedom to adjust as you need to based on the map situation and where enemies and friendlies are currently positioned. Of course, without all of the low ground positions, small Fulda actually has much more straightforward movement lanes. You have movement lanes through B, through A, and through C. There is some variation, and obviously these are not hard movement lanes with large obstacles in the way, so there's a lot of freedom to move within them, but you don't necessarily have to avoid the low ground positions like you do with Big Fulda. Now, since most of the power positions on small Fulda still apply to Big Fulda, I'm going to run through those first and then go to some of the Big Fulda power positions. Going from left to right, the A point actually has some fairly capable power positions that can overlook a lot of the main approaches to the B point, mostly locations around here and here. Now, the reason these are power positions is because there's actually a low rise right at A bit of a retainer wall if you will, and this allows you an elevated position where that you can use to peek over with a third-person camera and see when enemies may be paying attention to you and when they may not. This can allow you to sneak in shots when they aren't paying attention. Additionally, it actually has some okay visibility towards the B point and basically covers this entire gap between A and B. So these power positions are severely underrated and harder to contest than most people realize, especially if you have a tank with good gun depression or good reverse gears. Moving more towards the middle of the map, and the B point does represent a fairly respectable power position that can hold down the A point. Again, if A wants to shoot at you, they have to poke, and if they get too far from the retainer wall, they won't have any cover against your shots. So B does have excellent vision over the A point, even though A does have some positions that can potentially counter it. It's important to note there are also several rolling ridges between B and C that can be used to establish dominance over any of these sightlines in this general area, so especially if you have a tank with good gun depression, these are excellent parts of the map to use. Additionally, if you start migrating towards either spawn along this same line, there are power positions that overlook both spawns that can be occupied, and you should always be wary of enemies that are trying to sneak up on your teams and get into one of these positions. Now, the big thing about these rolling hills in the middle that you really want to annotate and keep in the back of your mind is that they are high enough that you won't often be able to see vehicles on the other side of them, but they're also low enough that you can third-person camera to see anybody on the other side. So the enemy near these hills will have the advantage in terms of overall vision and knowledge. It's important to note that especially if you want to use the middle of the map, you either have to stick to the recesses as much as possible, or alternatively you need a vehicle that can use these kind of positions. Migrating over to the C point and the castle itself is obviously a power position because it's a castle. Now, you can drive up on the ramparts, and the ramparts around C can actually see all the way into the B point, but only select parts of it. It can also see several of the approaches from both spawns, so it is actually a fairly useful position. Additionally, if you go on the outside of the castle and this outer walls, you can see all the way down into this little valley. The valley is not super useful on Little Fulda. Sometimes enemies will try to use it, but it's more of a power position if you get Big Fulda. Now, interestingly enough, both spawns actually have positions that overlook major entrances and exits to the castle here and here. These positions are actually reasonably difficult to contest if you know where to go and you know where to look to keep enemies from sneaking up on you. You do have fairly good vision, and there is a lot of ground enemy would have to cover in order to successfully push you, so if enemies don't know you're there, you can certainly get the drop on them. Moving on to Big Fulda, and the biggest thing you need to note about the power positions on Big Fulda is that the A point is in a bit of a bowl, and actually around the bowl, both on the left side and top side of the map, there is a ridge line that you can use to get fairly dominant positions, overlook A, and overlook anybody that might be going towards A. These are accessible to both teams, so you need to be aware of this, both in order to take advantage of it yourself, but also in order to counter enemies who may be going there. If you are trying to go for A, you need to be very aware that enemies will be in these positions and will be trying to snipe you. The power position at the castle, specifically the outside edge, becomes a lot more useful on Big Fulda because you can easily shoot down to anybody at C or going towards C, and it's very difficult to contest because there's a rock formation right at the edge that you can use for some pretty efficient hard cover. That being said, there are some positions far to the right side of the map that you can actually use pretty efficiently, especially if you have a long-range accurate gun and good thermals. It will be some pretty long shots hitting enemies that are camping the ridgeline and also the castle itself, but if you do have a laser rangefinder, you can pretty easily land them. Now, Fulda does have one rather interesting aspect, and that is the air spawns, specifically the helicopter spawns, are actually a little on the asymmetric side. The north side's helicopter spawns has a nice hill between them in the battlefield, so it's very easy for them to spawn without being contested and then go to whatever position they feel they need to at any point in the map. The south spawn's helipad, however, is actually visible from the map, so if a canny player from the north spawn takes their anti-air to the right position, they can shoot helicopters that are literally still on the helipad. That being said, in order to do this, you do have to go pretty far out to the right or even be on the castle itself in order to do this, but it's not impossible. It is actually a lot easier on Big Fulda because Big Fulda has a lot more room off to the right for you to go to, whereas Small Fulda, it's not quite enough and you kind of have to go into the castle, which can be very dangerous for a long-range anti-air. Now, looking specifically at the single cap A point on Small Fulda, the biggest thing they would note here is obviously fighting around the A cap is important, but watching the enemies that might be trying to flank you on the left side of A is important, but I would definitely not neglect what is normally the B cap. While players on point can use the various buildings and also the retainer wall as cover, the B cap can cut off a lot of reinforcements from the enemy team and make it a lot easier on their friendly players. I will also say anecdotally that the area that is between the A cap and normally where the B cap is, this gap right here, tends to be very under observed in this specific variant of the map, and especially because there's a ridge line going between the B and A cap that actually provides you with at least some cover if the enemy isn't paying attention to it. It's actually somewhat easy to use that little avenue as a movement lane, assuming the enemy aren't very heavy in that area. The big piece of advice I can give you if you do want to try to take this route is you do want to go up to the ridge, not expose yourself to hostile fire, and then just go straight into the A point, keeping yourself as exposed as little as possible. Once you get into the A point, obviously at that point you do have the natural cover of both the buildings and the retainer wall between you and the enemy, but there is always going to be a brief period where you are exposed to hostile fire. However, minimizing that by simply cutting to the A point basically in a straight line as quickly as possible can certainly mitigate the danger. The single cap B cap version of this map does play a bit like a normal game. I wouldn't sleep on the town that is normally the A cap because it can provide some useful suppression fire and cut off reinforcements from enemy on the capture point. However, you do want to focus most of your efforts on the B cap, and specifically you want to focus most of your efforts on these ridge lines that are between the normal B and C caps, because these ridge lines can control a lot of movement. Holding the castle itself is useful in this particular variant, at least to prevent you from getting flanked, but ultimately the vision you're going to get and the amount of the map you can control, especially around the capture point, is fairly limited. Certainly you can snipe enemies on the capture point from the castle, but it's not super reliable, and it is entirely possible that enemies can take the capture point without ever exposing themselves to you. Of course, the single cap C cap is a hybrid of spawn camping fest and absolute bloodbath on the castle ramparts because there's really no other way to play it. You either go straight to the castle and fight it out in appallingly close quarters given how much the rest of the map is, or you take the area to the north of A and try to go to the spawn camp and cut off the enemy team. Those are really the only two viable options available, as no other position can really see onto the capture point with any degree of consistency. As far as overall map flow, my general experience with Fulda has been that the north spawn has the biggest advantage around A because it can get both to the A point pretty quickly, but also has the best power positions ringing A on Big Fulda. So both Little Fulda and Big Fulda, it can both get to the town quickly on Little Fulda, and on Big Fulda can very easily and quickly wrap around to power positions. The south spawn, on the other hand, tend to have easier access to the C point and the camping spots around the C point, especially this one highway, which actually gives them a position that is relatively hard to contest, whereas the positions from the north spawn that you can use to contest the area in and around C are more restrictive in terms of their lines of sight and honestly more predictable. That being said, the incredibly tight quarters around the castle on the C point can really allow any team to equalize out disadvantages, take control of that, and then push out to other sections of the map with relative ease if they are good enough. So ultimately, controlling the castle is more important than controlling most of the areas on the south side of the map, and because it is such close range, neither team really has a firm advantage once you actually get there. I do find anecdotally, however, that if you control the castle, the north spawn has much better vision over the south spawn than vice versa, especially if you're using the elevated ramparts up top. The B point, in my opinion, is a lot more up in the air because it really comes down to who is more able to efficiently use these small hills in between B and C to their advantage. The team that can do that has very good vision on B and can capture B in such a way that A can't really do anything about it. Forces that one team has on A can certainly assist B by cutting off reinforcements and also limiting the approaches that the enemy team has, but ultimately the fights between B and C are probably going to dictate which team is going to get control over it, and ultimately both teams have pretty easy access to a series of hills that they can use to their advantage. So it's really just which team can use both the hills themselves and the areas around them the best. For me personally, what I've generally found is that the castle is a very high source of activity. Players see the castle, they recognize that it's an elevated position and that, at least on Big Fulda, it also controls a large section of the map, and you get a lot of fighting over it. That being said, once you get the castle, you still have to push out towards useful positions. It doesn't really control that much of the map by itself, at least on most variants. You can only really control the C point. So what I usually like to do instead is actually go for A. I find in my experience there's usually only a handful of people fighting around A, so it's very easy for one person who knows what they're doing to swing the tide, and once you swing the tide at A, you can actually get some pretty good positions to cut off enemy reinforcements around B, or even take out enemies that are on B themselves if they're not paying attention. The only real reason why I don't generally go for B is because B is very heavily contested and there are a lot of hold down positions that you can have to deal with while getting to B, or alternatively you can simply try to rush quickly directly towards it to beat the enemy so they're not set up by the time you pass them and take the B point rapidly. The advantage to controlling B is that B basically has access to C and A. It has dominant lines of sight over A and can push A very easily. Additionally, it can also move towards C very easily. So B is a very useful position to possess, but it's also a position that both teams are going to actively be fighting for a lot. And in my experience, these kind of hotly contested positions, one player tends to be a bit of a drop in the bucket. It doesn't have as much of an impact because you get 1 or 2 kills, but then the 3rd or 4th enemy kills you because there are so many enemies in and around that position that there's basically always going to be more people to fight. It's certainly a good thing if you have a tank with a lot of armor and that can take a lot of punishment, but if you have more light flanky tanks, B can be a bit of a rough sell. So after all that, what are my thoughts on Fulda? Small Fulda for me is, I would rate as a pretty good map. You usually have quite a few different options as to what you can do. There are a lot of avenues for making plays, and while it has movement lanes, the movement lanes are broad enough that you can make some decisions while you're in those movement lanes that can meaningfully impact how useful you are to your team and how you can win fights. On top of that, the combination of the castle, the points around A, and the points around B allow for a good variety in play between very close range brawling fights, also snipe fest, and even medium range engagements. The mixing and matching of different types of engagements and engagement ranges, along with enough terrain features that can allow you to use the third person camera or narrow lines of sight really efficiently, for me it just hits a bit of a sweet spot where the whole map just kind of comes together. That being said, I can't really say the same thing about Big Fulda. Ironically, despite being very similar to Small Fulda, the amount of camping that you open up on the left and right side is pretty extreme. So if you don't have a vehicle that is specifically geared towards long range engagements, you might find yourself at a sore disadvantage. This is even more exacerbated if you're playing at higher tiers and thermal imaging starts to become widely available and you haven't researched it yet. Big Fulda can be very obnoxious if you don't have thermal imaging, and especially laser rangefinders as well researched, because because there are some very long sight lines you can absolutely get plastered from. On top of that, Big Fulda pushes 2 of the capture points from medium to close range engagements all the way out to super long range engagements where you can get sniped from a bunch of different angles. So on the whole, while I do actually really enjoy Little Fulda, Big Fulda I'm a lot less enthusiastic about. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. What are your thoughts on the Fulda map? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? Please let me know down in the comments down below. I always love to hear from you guys. If you like the video, like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.